Rachel Grimm, and welcome to the podcast With All Your Mind. I'm here to help us understand the Bible with cultural and historical context, linguistic info, and other cool stuff. Enjoy. All right, guys, welcome back. This is Rachel, and this is With All Your Mind. And we are starting our series about language, linguistics, cultural influences, ways that we can see bits and pieces of culture in the Bible. And I'm starting you out. I'm starting you out with a softball, and I hope you appreciate it. I was going to dive right into a Hebrew linguistics thing. It's one of my favorites that I was like, this is so cool. Like, I wish I had known this before. And apparently it's not that widely known. But now that I know it, I want everybody else to know it. And I'm like, no, wait. Let's do something that's a little bit more well-known first, okay? So I'm going to start you off slow. And today we're going to do Hebrew poetry, Hebrew writing styles, something that's more of a bigger picture kind of thing rather than more details. It's a more familiar topic. And it's something that if you've ever studied an Old Testament book, especially Proverbs, you'll at least be somewhat familiar with it. So we're going to talk about more linguistic-y things, including, I think next, we're going to talk about some Hebrew verb stuff. Get prepared. And how a Hebrew speaker was forced, basically, to say yes and no, simply because that's how the language worked. We're going to get into that. The yes and no part is one of my favorite things. But for now, we're going to talk about content and style. And so we're going to talk about that with Hebrew forms of poetry, because you'll actually be surprised by how much of this is all through the Old Testament, not just in kind of the more poetic books that we think about with Proverbs and Song of Solomon. So let's start with talking about what we know about poetry in general, in English, before we get into Hebrew. So when I say poetry, what do you think of? And I just want you to think about whatever when I say poetry. I think of a couple of things. I think of nursery rhymes, like Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. You know, it has a rhyme to it. I think of Shakespeare. I actually think a little bit about Russian poetry, because when I was first learning Russian, I read a lot of Pushkin, and Pushkin wrote a lot of poetry. I also think of limericks, because I'm personally a fan of limericks, because you don't have to think too hard about them. But some other technical terms for poetry and poetic things is alliteration, rhyming. And if you think about Shakespeare, you almost definitely have to think about iambic pentameter. I had to look it up to see what it was. I don't think I still understand what it means. But that's the thing with Shakespeare. So I have a few examples for you of what we as English speakers think of as kind of like classic poetry, like definitely poetry. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. So that's a rhyme. It rhymes, and it has syllables, an order of syllables, and then a rhyming words at the end of each line. Then there's some limericks. I had fun looking these up. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared, 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their best nest in my beard." I didn't even do that one well. Let's try the next one. I think I can do this one better. There once was a man from Nantucket who kept all his cash in a bucket, but his daughter named Nan ran away with a man, and as for the Beckett, Nantucket. It's a joke, and I didn't get it the first time I read it. Okay. Another kind of poetry that doesn't rely on rhymes and meter or alliteration is Japanese poetry, haikus. I used to love haikus. I still have like a little soft spot for them. My best friend from college and I went to the Bahamas our senior year, and it was fun. Like, we had a good time, even though it was like cloudy, like 75% of the time we were there, and everything seemed to go wrong. But one of the things that we did when we were on this trip was that we wrote haikus about everything that happened. I was trying to think, did we take a notebook with us? Are we like the nerds that took a notebook? I guess we did. I don't know. It's like we were in college, so I guess we had plenty of notebooks. Anyway, so here are some of the examples of haiku. And if you don't know, a haiku is a 3-lined poem that doesn't have to rhyme or anything at all about rhyme or sounding the same, like alliteration or assonance or anything like that. You just need 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and then 5 again in the last. So 5, 7, 5. So we made fun of our hotel room because there were so many little problems with it. So this was a haiku about our hotel room. They gave us no soap. The green curtains fell on Steph. The ceiling fell too. It's not exactly beautiful sounding, but haikus can be fun because you're just ordering it a particular way and you can say whatever you want. Another one was about a day trip that we took, and they had flyers at this hotel about, hey, take this day trip. It'll be so fun. And they had pictures, and it was like, this trip was not what it was, not what it was advertised to be. So this was the haiku about the trip. The flyer said caves. We thought it would be real caves. Definitely not. There's your haikus. So that's how Western English poetry usually works, and Japanese poetry. English poetry typically loves alliteration, like in Sally's Seashells and Peter Piper. We love rhyme. It's all about the sound of the poetry. Classical or biblical Hebrew has several ways to make poetry, but it's much more about how to organize the ideas. And none of them have to do with the sound. One is alphabetical, that's an acrostic, and the other 2 have to do with structure. So the first one you can see is if you just flip to any old page in the book of Proverbs. I randomly looked up Proverbs 7 because I really wanted to see if I was just totally random about it, could I find this in there? And I started counting something and I immediately wanted to stop because there were so many and I got irritated right away. So 3 verses, the first 3 verses in Proverbs go like this. And open up your Bible if you can. And this is Proverbs 7, verses 1, 2, and 3. And this is an example of one of these ways to organize information. So just see if you can figure it out, and you might already know it. My son, keep my words and store up my commands within you. Verse 2, keep my commands and you will live. Guard my teachings as the apple of your eye. Verse 3, bind them on your fingers and write them on the tablet of your heart. Each verse contains one idea said 2 different ways. I was doing homework for this audit class, and it was translating Proverbs was part of the homework. And in the instructions for the assignment, the professor had written, this is an example of parallelism. This is what we're going to talk about, parallelism. And if you can't translate this verb in the second line or the first line, remember, it's parallelism. They're going to have similar meaning. So if you look up a word and it says something totally random and you're like, that can't be right, you're good for you. Think about it in terms of meaning because it's parallel. It's going to have a very similar meaning from one verb to the next in the same line. So, for parallelism, it's all about parallel ideas. The meaning is going to be very similar, even if it's a different word. So parallelism, parallel ideas. One line in Proverbs will have the same idea said in 2 different ways. So Proverbs 7 contains one kind of parallelism. It's called synonymous parallelism, and that's what I was just talking about. One idea said 2 different ways. Each part of the verse says basically the same thing. It sounds repetitive in English. It sounds kind of boring, like, didn't you already say this? But it's just a form of poetry. Another form of parallelism is called emblematic parallelism. And this is where an illustration or an analogy gives a colorful picture of a truth or a circumstance. So I have 2 examples of that. So Psalm 42:1, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. So it gives a picture from nature, like a deer. That's how I am. Proverbs 11:22, like a gold ring in a pig's snout, is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. So a pig that you give something expensive and fancy to is like a woman, a beautiful woman who just flaunts everything. Right? So it's a colorful picture to show a truth or a circumstance. Whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't matter. I'm just showing you examples. So let's go on to the next thing that you probably almost definitely have heard of with the Bible, and that's an acrostic. And I am going to use an example, and you can do this in any language in a lot of different ways. It's using the alphabet to characterize or start each line or word or paragraph. So a famous example in the Bible that you probably know is there, Psalm 119. It's the longest chapter in the whole Bible, and it's most famous partly, or almost definitely, because your English Bible will tell you it's an acrostic. And I looked all of my Bibles, ESV, NIV, NET, New King James. They all have something in there to show you that it's an acrostic. And the way it's organized in that chapter is that each chunk of 8 verses has a heading of a Hebrew letter. And it might tell you in Hebrew, it might have that Hebrew letter there, or it might spell it out in English. So Aleph would be first, and then Beit, and sometimes they say Veit, and then Gimel, and then Dalet, and then Hey. Check your Bible, it will be in there. And I even went online to see if an online Bible would do it. Yep, they do it too. They just have a little heading at the top of each chunk of 8 verses to say, okay, this chunk is Aleph. This chunk is Beit. Okay, so you might have seen that and be like, oh, there's an acrostic there. But what's going on in the Hebrew? What's actually happening? What does it mean that it's an acrostic? So like I said, there are 8 verses in each chunk. In Hebrew, each verse, each individual verse begins with that letter. Psalm 119 is famous for it because it's such a huge chapter and it's a complete acrostic. There's actually a whole lot of other acrostics in the Old Testament. And this is one of the things that I learned at SBL. There was a student there that was presenting, I don't know if it was part of her PhD dissertation or I don't know what it was particularly, but she was talking about acrostics, and I learned more about acrostics than I ever have in my whole life just from this 25-minute presentation by a girl from Cambridge. So there are other acrostics in Psalm 9, Psalm 10, Psalm 111, Psalm 112. I never knew that Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman, that whole section about the virtuous woman, it's a poem because it's an acrostic. And there's also Lamentations. The first part of the first chapter of Lamentations is a whole acrostic. And then in Nahum. So like I said, Psalm 119 is just one example of a complete acrostic. But so is the part about the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. It's complete. Other acrostics might not be complete acrostics. Some of them I looked at have every other letter. Like they'll do, instead of Aleph, Beit, Gimel, they'll do Aleph, Gimel, and then they'll skip to, like 1, 3, 5, 7. They'll do the odd ones. And then other ones have a couple of letters switched around. And the girl that was presenting at SBL said that might have been because the alphabet wasn't completely standardized at the time that acrostic was written, A complete acrostic would have to depend on a perfect alphabet that didn't change at all, and that wasn't necessarily the case. So some of them go on every other letter. Some have different features, like having a few letters mixed around. So it was really cool to learn about them. So enough about acrostics. We're going to move on to our last one. And this is one that's a little bit tricky to learn about because it's really hard to just listen and learn about this one. It really helps to have a visual. If it helps you, look it up online later. I'm going to give you a few ideas of how to think about it, but it might help. Chiasms. And this is sometimes called chiasmus, but chiasm or chiastic structure. And it's spelled C-H-I, chiasm. I first encountered this in a hermeneutics class about maybe 3 years ago. I took an online hermeneutics class because Well, I don't know why now, but it's actually a really good idea. Hermeneutics is how to study the Bible. Basically, what are the basic principles that you need to know before you even start learning anything? That's a hermeneutics class, how to interpret the Bible. And it gives you just real basic principles about this is dumb, this is a good way to do it, be logical, don't lose your brain, don't throw it out just because it's the Bible, blah, blah, blah. So they talked about chiasms in this hermeneutics class. And I thought it was kind of odd, like we're learning about how to interpret the Bible. Why are we talking about this kind of poetic form? And I asked Ryan because it seemed kind of sussy. I was like, what is this? And I was like, have you ever heard of a chiasm? And he's like, oh yeah. And then that just made me feel dumb, like I'd never heard about it before. But it was one of those things that felt kind of like the secret knowledge, the secret stuff in the Bible. And I didn't want to be like taken down this weird path of weird ways to think about the Bible. And so that's why I checked with Ryan. I figured if he knew about it and it was an okay thing with him, he's like my basic pragmatic guy. If Ryan thinks it's stupid, it's probably stupid. Wait, no, that's not true. He thinks a lot of stuff is stupid. Anyway. If it sounds kind of mystical, hokey, over-interpreting the Bible, I get you. I understand. I thought the same thing, and I had to be reassured by somebody else, a live, living person, that it wasn't weird. So if you need to find another live, living person to do that for you, I will not take offense. Please go for it. And it can be overdone. This looking for chiastic structures in the Bible can be overdone. So you can't just Google it and believe everything that you see. Like, don't do that anyway, right? Don't believe everything you see on Google, right? So chiasm or chiasmus is a Greek word meaning to form like the letter chi or chi or chi in Greek, which is an X. It means to make something look like an X. There are nerves in the body. I got this from the Wikipedia page. Just look it up if you want to. There are nerves in the body that are called chiastic because they cross over each other and it looks like an X. It's used in genetics for the same reason. And in the Hebrew Bible and in other literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Beowulf and even more modern works, it's referring to something like an idea sandwich or something like what your high school English lit teacher told you about how to write a paper. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. It's a little bit like a chiasm. My mental image that I thought really helped with this idea is I often think of it as an hourglass, where the top and the bottom halves are parallel ideas. Okay? There's lots of one-liners that you can think of as a chiasm, and you can think of it as a strip of paper that you twist, and it has a little narrow point in the middle, like how you make a Mobius strip. I've never done that, but I'm imagining. If you take something and twist it, it doubles over in the middle, and that's like the connecting point, right? So one-liners can be chiasms or chiastic structures as well. A famous one, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, JFK, right? So one-liners can be chiasms. A passage can be a chiasm, or a whole like paragraph, chapter, couple of chapters, passage, 10 chapters could be a chiasm. And that's where it can get a little bit tricky to try and figure out what's a chiasm and what isn't. But we're going to go through examples. But first I made my own because that seemed fun. So I took a song, Sound of Music, and I made up my own chiasm with the Sound of Music. Okay, so here it is. The first two lines are from the song, and then I made the chiasm out of the rest of it. The hills are alive with the sound of music, with songs they have sung for 1,000 years. Songs make me feel alive. There are songs that have been sung for thousands of years, and the hills are alive with them. All right? That is a chiastic structure, or a chiasm, where you have a couple of related ideas, a central idea, and then you go back to those first ideas and echo them, either with the same words or different words. But basically it's like an A, B, C, B, A. My Ben, my kindergartner, Ben, is learning about A-B patterns in school. And he says A-B pattern. And so everywhere he looks, he's like, Mommy, it's an A-B pattern. And so I'm seeing patterns everywhere too. And I'm like, hey, buddy, it's an A-B pattern. So in chiasms, it's something like A, B, C, B, A. And you can have as many or as few of them as you want. You can do A, B, C, D, E, D, C, B, A, right? It's just all about echoing around a central idea. Okay? So it can be very complicated or relatively simple, and it's often used to highlight a central point. In our chiasm with the sound of music, we want to talk about songs and landscape, but the point is to show you how I relate to songs. So I wanted to take an example from the Bible because that's what we're talking about. We need an example from the Bible. And I talked to Ryan and I was like, what example should we use? And he was like, oh yeah, like the flood story. Yeah, the entire flood story is a chiasm. So it means it's massive, it's enormous. And the creation story is a giant chiasm, the entire story. So that's way too complicated for us to look at. So I found a much simpler example. It's Joshua 1:5-9. And it certainly helps to see why there might be repetition. I'll read it and then I'll do the chiastic structure. Verse 5. No one will be, the background for this. This is when God is encouraging Joshua. And he's telling him, buck up, man. I'm going to be with you. Go ahead and enter that land of Canaan. I'll be with you. Okay? So he's saying, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. I think that one's a little bit easier to see because we know those words, repetition in those words, be with you, strong and courageous. So here it is. It's an A, B, C, D, C, B, A. A, I will always be with you. That's A on both ends. It doesn't even change. B, be strong and courageous. That one doesn't change. C, obey all the law. Obey all the law. And in the middle, that D, what's the central point? Meditate on the law. So some of these chiasms, they really make a big point of what's that middle point? What's the central point of the whole thing? For this one, it would be meditate on the law. Sometimes finding the middle, that lone central point, gives you the point of the entire passage. And it's a really complicated structure. Like, I feel like I would never be able to write this way. I just, I did the Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music one, but I stole half of that, So it is a more complicated structure. We do it in English too, though. One of the interesting things that I read was that people have wondered, and it's debated, if the whole Harry Potter series or each book, I forget which one it is or has a chiastic structure. And it is, I'm going to put in, by the way, into the show notes, a blog by an author who gives writing advice. And she talks about chiastic structures and how they're really helpful. And it's actually a lot of the structure that novels use anyway. So it's a really comfortable and familiar structure for us. It gives a peak, tension moment and lots of more minor tension moments, and then a resolution. And we find resolutions comforting. It brings us back to the beginning. It brings us full circle, that kind of thing. So this is not a foreign idea. I found lots of articles talking about it with the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't know what other ancient works used it, but I found a lot on the Iliad and the Odyssey. So yeah, it goes to show, if anybody talks about the Bible being written by really uneducated people that probably didn't know what they were doing, this kind of thing says no. No, just because they were uneducated didn't necessarily make them dumb. And we don't need to treat them like they were dumb just so that we feel better about ourselves if we're dumb. You know what I mean? And chiasms do show up a lot in the New Testament as well. It was both a Greek and a Semitic way of writing. It is not just Semitic. So it shows up in the New Testament as well. Paul does it. Some of the gospel writers do it. So yeah, it's all through the Bible. So I like this because it goes to show that these writers really thought hard about what they were writing. And they didn't just slap down information either. They had style. They were making really interesting stuff. They weren't just banging out a job and getting the words down on paper. They were doing it with style. So with acrostics, with chiasms, with parallelism, the Bible is actually really full of style. So if you've ever thought the Bible is kind of boring with style, it's not. It's just because it's not a style that we typically use or is very recognizable because it's in another language. And because it's through translation, it's a little bit harder to see these things. Okay, so yeah, have new appreciation for the Book of Lamentations and for Proverbs 31, that passage about a virtuous woman, that's a poem, okay? So there you go. I hope you enjoyed, and we have lots of good stuff to talk about coming up next, all right? So you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you again the next time. Bye.